everybody. Happy Thursday, post-rainstorm Thursday this week, which is a very exciting thing to say. Because of the rain, I didn't bring in plants. I brought in some artwork this week because the plants were all wet and heavy. But these guys are so cute. I just thought it'd make a fun background. With Erica this week, because we had these torrential downpours, does that sound right? We're going to talk about how we can utilize that for our yards, what to do, when to turn the sprinklers back on, because we know everyone's turned them off already, right? And so she'll give us some advice, some tips, and educate us on best practices after rain. Okay.
Hello.
Feel free to rock the bird if you want to.
I think it's still rocking.
It's still rocking.
We're good. Okay, so one of the questions that we get a lot here at the nursery is, what does it mean when somebody tells you, some agency, if it's if it's a nursery, if it's a conservation district, if it's something like that, if they say you should apply this many inches of water, like a 1/4 inch or 1 inch of water, what does that actually mean? The easiest way to visualize that are catch cups, and you take these little cups. You can use tuna cans, or sometimes cat food comes in these little plastic cups. You can take those out, and then what you do is you set them up in sort of a grid pattern on your lawn or in a flower bed, and then you run your sprinklers. And you or like in the case of drip, you can lift the emitter and put the emitter in the cup and see how much water comes out that way. But you run your sprinklers for a certain amount of time, and then you extrapolate from there to figure out how many inches of water are being distributed. Sometimes it's common sense and sometimes it's not. So 1 inch is literally how much water you'd have to water over the entire area in order to accomplish a depth of 1 inch. It doesn't mean that you'll see 1 inch on top of the soil, because it's filtering in, it's going through the soil. So it's not like you're looking at applying standing water. You run your sprinklers enough that if it were being caught in a cup, that it would equate to 1 inch. 1 inch is actually quite a lot of water. That's not something that I think one time I heard, my numbers are probably way off on this, but in a typical year, Utah usually gets something like Salt Lake, 13 to 25 inches of water in an entire year of precipitation. Snow equates a little bit differently, but if a rainstorm is only delivering rain for 30 minutes, it might only be delivering 0.2 or 0.03 inches of water if it's just a light misting. And so you can't always judge how much water has come down without checking with the weather services. A lot of them will record the amount of water that a particular storm delivered. You can have rain gauges out in your yard that will tell you how much water you got in your yard so that you can adjust your sprinklers accordingly. I can't remember exactly, but I think it's a 1/4 inch of water a week will be a typical recommendation for turf. And so if a rainstorm delivers a 1/4 inch of water in one storm, then you shouldn't need to run your sprinklers again for an entire week. And I'm not sure how much rain we got out of this last storm, but quite a bit. It rained all day yesterday at the nursery. So I wouldn't be surprised if we had well over an inch here at the nursery.
Sandy had 2.5 inches.
Yeah, 2.5 inches is a lot of water. There are ways to capture the water and use it. One way are rain barrels. It used to be that it was illegal in Utah to capture rainwater and use it unless you were an agricultural facility. Years ago, it is no longer illegal, but they do have some maximums on what they prefer you not to collect more than. I think most of urban Utah is 500 gallons that you can collect and store, and you could easily collect 500 gallons in a single rainstorm if you had a couple of different barrels. Usually those attach to a downspout, and the surface area of the roof all goes in your gutters, and your gutters all go to a specific place. And so if you imagine the square footage and how much rain you're capturing, it's really easy to capture that much water. And a lot of those rain barrels will have either a tap on them that you can open and fill watering cans, or they'll have attachments for hoses, and then the gravity pushes the water through the hose. Some of them will even have pumps. In certain situations, you can qualify for what's called a cistern, which is a buried tank. And some cisterns are available in the thousands of gallons, like 2,500 gallon cisterns. But usually those are, again, for more sort of agricultural sites. It's not something that you would see in a residential area, but you can bury the rain catchment if you plan ahead and you know that you want rain. If you want rain barrels somewhere in your yard, you don't have to have them above ground. You could have them below ground, and then they wouldn't be an eyesore. And that is a really good way to add additional water to your yard even after the rainstorm. Having a couple hundred gallons that you can distribute over the next couple of weeks. That's a really great way to do it. One thing that you should consider when you are landscaping is whether a hard surface that you're using is permeable or not. That will change the amount of water that your landscape, your yard retains or is able to use. Concrete is impervious, it's impermeable, and so the water just runs off it toward the gutters. And if you think about a typical driveway being something like 2,000 square feet of concrete, especially if you've got an RV pad up the side of your house, that's a lot of rain that you are not taking advantage of in your yard. So there are ways, if you plan ahead, you can have some sort of rock mulch, and then the rock mulch is permeable, and the water will generally drain down into your soil instead of off into a gutter, like the street gutter. Or you can have pavers and have a joint between the pavers so that the water will go down through the pavers. This really helps when you're planning for the amount of water that larger trees will need. So if you're planting a tree that's going to have a wide root system, like it's going to be a large tree at maturity, you can definitely hardscape near that, but think about the roots and what they're going to do long term. And if you put paver stones or flagstone or something near it, that tree is going to have access to a whole lot more water than if you put concrete over part of that root system, or part of the area that the roots could eventually grow. The roots are going to follow the water. And so, like oftentimes in a park strip, if you dug up a tree that's been planted in a park strip, the roots, a lot of them are going to be long and narrow and follow the park strip because that's where the water has been available. Some sometimes those roots will go under the sidewalk into the rest of the yard, but that's, really for larger trees. You won't see that on every tree. The Natural History Museum up at the University of Utah has a paved parking lot. Their tiered parking lot is all paved for water retention, catchment, and they use that water for their landscaping. The Conservation Garden Park over here in West Jordan, they also have a paver stone parking lot to capture that water. It can be more expensive initially, but as we move forward, we're going to have to come up with more and more creative ways to keep the water that we do get, because we don't get a lot of water. It's a finite resource, and it's something that we need to be mindful of.
So along those lines, of people that turned off their sprinklers knowing the rain was coming and then were joyously rewarded with 2.5 inches, what would you say, like, what are next steps for homeowners that, like me, I unplugged my sprinkler system, I danced in the rain, well, not really, but I pretended in my imagination that I did, and now I'm like, oh, well, I guess, do I wait like a week before I plug them back in? What would be some guidelines of like practical things we can do? Because I didn't build rain barrels in advance, I wish I had. But what would you be like the recommended next steps right now for folks?
The best way to know when to turn your sprinklers back on is to monitor, to watch your soil, to go and dig little holes in your yard every so often, every couple of distances, and then you check and see how wet the soil is. Sometimes one house will have a totally different irrigation necessity than the next house because of grading. So sometimes in a neighborhood, well, every neighborhood, there are higher houses and lower houses, and sometimes the higher houses, those yards will drain slowly toward the lower houses, and so the one at the end of the street that's the low house might not need to turn on their sprinklers for an extra few days over the top house. That it also, a lot of these really steep yards that have levels in them, a lot of times that can change how quickly you need to turn your sprinklers back on, because if most of your plantings are at the bottom of your steep yard, then a lot of that water is going to collect in the bottom faster. That's something that you should keep in mind also when you are designing a landscape, knowing what the water is likely to do. If there's a low spot and you have clay, and you can kind of plan ahead and go, oh, I imagine that spot is going to stay wet for a long time after a rainstorm, then you can pick things to put in that area of your yard that are more tolerant of wet conditions. So right now, to know when to turn your sprinklers back on, it's really just kind of knowing what your conditions are and checking your soil and seeing, looking at your plants and seeing when they start to look like they need a little bit of water. My guess is with how much water we got, you could easily skip a whole week of irrigation, potentially longer now that we're starting to cool down. That's temperature is another thing to factor in. If we end up back in the 90s, and it is possible that we'll even go over 100 again. It's not in the forecast right now, but it's possible. That can change how quickly you would need to turn your irrigation back on. The hot temperatures increase what's called transpiration rates in the plants, and the hotter the air above, the faster the water is pulled through the plants and the faster the soil dries out. And so it's not just the ambient temperature that you need to consider, it's that the water is moving faster and you need to compensate. But right now it's, I would say, at least a week.
It's cool. It's wet. It feels like Portland for a few minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, fall temperatures are my favorite. I love these fall rainstorms.
That's awesome.
It's the best. A lot of places around the South get monsoon weather in the fall, and I love it.
That's awesome. All right. Well, any other advice for homeowners, yard care, work taker, or others post rainstorm?
Watch for water that's collecting next to your house. Make sure that you don't have any water pooling anywhere and that it's not getting into your basements. You can, again, change the grading of your landscape to try and increase drainage away from the home. Your contractor should have done that when they built your house, but sometimes over the years soil settles and you might have water running toward your foundation instead of away from it. So check that for sure. Watch for places where maybe some mulch or soil has washed across a sidewalk, as an example, because that'll give you ideas of how to either make use of that water by changing your plantings, and try and stop the excess water from washing across. But it can also be a liability, I guess. If during the rainstorm you have flooding that's going across a public space like the sidewalk, it's kind of a gray area on whether you as the homeowner are responsible for it. But if there's a condition on your property that makes it so it's a dangerous condition on the sidewalk, then you can be held liable if something happens there. Like if there are pieces of bark and somebody, trips on it. I don't know the exact rules about it, but it's something to consider. Watch for how the water is draining off your property.
Cool. Thank you, Erica. Are you as excited about all this rain as I am?
Yeah.
Did you just stand there with a grin on your face all day, like, yay?
Well, I was outside all day yesterday, so it's a good thing I have rain gear.
Yes, awesome. Well, thank you, Erica. We appreciate it. That's helpful. Okay, so some good advice on watering, potentially collecting it if we get more storms, and thank you. That was really helpful. So we'll see you next week. If you have any questions, please pop them in the comments or message us. And if you have any requests for what you'd like to learn next week, let us know. Right, bye.